September the 2nd, 1945. The deck of the USS Missouri sat low in the water beneath a sky that had turned iron gray over Tokyo Bay. The great battleship, one of the most powerful warships ever built by human hands, rocked gently on a quiet sea. Around her, an armada of Allied warships stretched to the horizon in every direction, their silhouettes dark and immovable against the pale morning light. Overhead, formations of American aircraft thundered in tight formations, hundreds of them, their engines a continuous roar that shook the air and rattled the bones of every man who stood on those decks below. It was a show of power, deliberate, calculated, absolute. And on that deck, history was about to be made, not with bullets, not with bombs, but with a pen, a folding table, and a moment of silence that would echo through the decades. But before the ink dried, before the surrender documents were signed, something happened that most history books brush past in a single sentence or skip altogether. Something that revealed in a few quiet, shattering seconds exactly what kind of man General Douglas MacArthur was, and exactly what kind of force of will it took to close the most destructive war in human history on his terms. If you want to understand what really happened on that deck, and why the Japanese officers who arrived that morning looked as though they were walking to their own executions, you need to go back. You need to understand the road that led every single person standing on that ship to that single, suspended moment in time. And if stories like this are what bring history alive for you, hit subscribe right now. Every week, we go deep into the moments that shaped the modern world, the decisions, the confrontations, the personalities that textbooks summarize in a paragraph but that deserve an hour of your time. Hit subscribe because this one is just getting started. To understand what Douglas MacArthur did on the deck of the Missouri, you first have to understand what Japan had done to the Pacific, to Asia, to millions of human beings across a decade and a half of imperial expansion driven by a ferocity that stunned even hardened military observers. Japan in the early 20th century was a nation caught between two worlds. On one hand, it had modernized with breathtaking speed in the decades following the Meiji Restoration of 1868. It had built railways, a modern navy, a conscript army modeled on the great European powers. It had defeated Russia in 1905, shocking the entire world by becoming the first Asian nation to defeat a European power in a modern war. It had won territory in the Pacific during the First World War, standing alongside the Allied powers and emerging from that conflict with its reputation and its territory expanded. But underneath the modern infrastructure, underneath the suits and the battleships and the factories, there was something else entirely. A culture of military obedience and warrior honor so deeply ingrained that it had become indistinguishable from the national identity itself. The samurai code Bushido had been adapted and weaponized by Japan's military establishment into something that celebrated self-sacrifice, contempt for surrender, and a willingness to inflict suffering without hesitation. The Emperor Hirohito sat at the center of this structure, revered not merely as a political leader but as a living god, a divine figure descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. The Japanese soldier did not fight for his country in the way a British or American soldier might understand. He fought for his emperor, he died for his emperor, and to surrender, to lay down arms and submit to an enemy, was not merely defeat. It was an act so shameful it barely had a word in the Japanese vocabulary that could express its full degradation. This belief system, applied to a modern industrial military machine, produced results that were terrifying to behold. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the world watched but did little. When Japanese forces pushed deep into China in 1937, the world winced but looked away. And then came Nanking. The fall of Nanking in December of 1937 produced one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Over the course of 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers killed somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. They did not just kill them, they organized killing competitions. Officers stood and watched while their troops beheaded prisoners. Women were raped and murdered in numbers too vast to comprehend. Bobbies were bayoneted. The elderly were doused in kerosene and set alight. The Yangtze River ran red for days. This was not a breakdown of discipline. This was the Japanese military operating within its own moral framework, a framework that saw the Chinese people as racially inferior, as subhuman obstacles to the divine mission of imperial expansion. Japanese soldiers who took prisoners were sometimes reprimanded. Those who killed without hesitation were celebrated. This is the context. This is what Douglas MacArthur knew. This is what every man on the deck of the Missouri knew. This is what made the ceremony of September the 2nd, 1945 not merely a formality, but the closing act of a titanic struggle between two entirely different visions of what civilization meant. Douglas MacArthur had been born in 1880 at an army post in Little Rock, Arkansas. His father, Arthur MacArthur, had been a celebrated Civil War soldier who had won the Medal of Honor at the age of 18 charging Confederate lines at the Battle of Missionary Ridge. The shadow of that father, heroic and towering, fell across Douglas MacArthur's entire life. He was raised on military bases, surrounded by the rituals and hierarchies of Army life, absorbing its values, its certainties, its demand for absolute performance. He graduated from West Point in 1903 at the top of his class. His academic performance remains among the highest in the institution's history. He was brilliant, vain, theatrical, and utterly relentless. He served in the Philippines as a young officer, observing Japanese expansion in Asia with a professional's eye. He served in France during the First World War, commanding a brigade and then a division with a personal courage that became almost legendary. He had a habit of walking inspection lines under artillery fire without a helmet or a gas mask, as if daring German shells to touch him. After the First World War, he returned to West Point as its superintendent, modernizing its curriculum, dragging it into the 20th century over the fierce resistance of the institution's traditionalists. He was Army Chief of Staff in the early 1930s, which put him in Washington during the darkest days of the Great Depression, and which produced one of the most controversial episodes of his career. In the summer of 1932, tens of thousands of veterans of the First World War descended on Washington demanding early payment of a bonus the government had promised them for their service. They set up makeshift camps in the Capitol. President Hoover ordered them dispersed. MacArthur, with Major Dwight Eisenhower reluctantly at his side, led cavalry troops and soldiers with fixed bayonets and tear gas against the veterans. The bonus army's camps were burned. Men were beat. MacArthur convinced himself and attempted to convince others that the veterans had been infiltrated by communist agitators. It was a moment that permanently stained his reputation among the American working class, but it also revealed something fundamental about Douglas MacArthur. He did not bend, he did not hesitate. When he made a decision, he executed it with total commitment, regardless of what the world thought of him afterward. He retired from the American Army in 1937 and went to the Philippines, where he had been invited to build up the Filipino military in preparation for the island's eventual independence. He wore the uniform of a field marshal of the Philippine Army, a rank he had essentially designed for himself, complete with a cap so laden with gold braid that American officers quietly called it the scrambled egg hat. He lived in a luxury penthouse at the Manila Hotel with his wife Jean and their young son Arthur. He moved through Manila's social circles like a visiting emperor. And then on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. A few hours later, Japanese aircraft struck MacArthur's airfields in the Philippines, destroying much of his air power on the ground. The reasons why this happened, why MacArthur's forces were caught so exposed after receiving news of Pearl Harbor, remain disputed and deeply uncomfortable. What followed was a catastrophe. Japanese forces under General Masaharu Hama landed in the Philippines on December 10th. MacArthur's forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula, where they made a stand that was desperate, heroic, and ultimately doomed. Outnumbered, undersupplied, starving, riddled with malaria and dysentery, the American and Filipino defenders of Bataan held on for months while MacArthur directed the defense from the fortress island of Corregidor at the mouth of Manila Bay. The men on Bataan called themselves the Battling Bastards of Bataan. There was a bitter little poem that circulated among the troops. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam, no aunts, no uncles, no nephews, no nieces, no pills, no planes, no artillery pieces, and nobody gives a damn. MacArthur's decision to remain on Corregidor while his men died on Bataan earned him the nickname Dugout Doug, a nickname his troops used with undisguised contempt. Whether the contempt was fair is a matter historians still argue. What is not disputed is that in March of 1942, on direct orders from President Roosevelt, MacArthur was evacuated from Corregidor by PT boat, racing through Japanese-patrolled waters to Mindanao, and then by aircraft to Australia. When he arrived in Australia expecting to find a large American force ready to relieve the Philippines, he found almost nothing. The Pacific had been stripped of resources to feed the war in Europe and North Africa. It was in Australia that he made the statement that would define the next 3 years of his life. I came through, he said, and I shall return. The fall of Bataan came in April 1942. 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers surrendered to the Japanese, the largest surrender of American forces since the Civil War. What followed became known as the Bataan Death March. The Japanese marched their prisoners 65 miles in the brutal Philippine heat toward a prisoner of war camp in the north. There was almost no food, almost no water. Men who fell were bayoneted or beheaded on the spot. Some were buried alive, others were used for bayonet practice. Japanese officers rode past on horseback and watched. Those who tried to help the fallen were killed alongside them. Approximately 10,000 men died on that march. When the details reached the outside world, they hardened the Allied resolve into something beyond military calculation. This was not just a war anymore, it was a moral reckoning. MacArthur in Australia was given command of the Southwest Pacific area. He had a theater, but he had almost nothing to fill it with. The Japanese were advancing everywhere. They had taken the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. They stood at the gates of Australia, their aircraft bombing Darwin on the northern coast. What followed over the next 3 years was one of the most extraordinary campaigns in military history. MacArthur, working with what he had rather than what he needed, devised a strategy of island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions and cutting them off, letting them wither on the vine while advancing steadily toward Japan itself. He worked with Admiral Chester Nimitz, whose Central Pacific Drive complemented MacArthur's Southwest Pacific advance, though the relationship between the two commanders was never simple. The battles were savage beyond description. Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Solomons, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, each island became its own particular hell. Japanese soldiers did not surrender. They fought to the last man, to the last bullet, sometimes to the last breath. When the ammunition ran out, they mounted banzai charges, masses of men running toward American positions with bayonets fixed, screaming for the emperor. When the banzai charges failed, they crawled into caves and died there rather than come out with their hands raised. The casualty rates on both sides were horrific, and it was becoming obvious to Allied planners that an invasion of the Japanese home islands, which had been given the codename Operation Downfall, would produce casualties on a scale that was almost unimaginable. Estimates varied, but the numbers being discussed in 1945 were staggering. The Joint Chiefs of Staff projected between 250,000 and over 1 million American casualties for an invasion. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, would likely run into the millions. Japan's military leadership had already begun preparing the civilian population for what was called the Ketsugo strategy, the final decisive battle on Japanese soil, in which every man, woman, and child was expected to fight to the death with bamboo spears if necessary. Women were being trained with bamboo spears. Children were being organized into resistance units. The Japanese military was stockpiling thousands of kamikaze aircraft, piloted suicide bombs, for use against the invasion fleet. MacArthur himself, who had been designated commander of all army forces for the invasion of Japan, was deeply troubled by what was coming. He had seen enough dying. He understood the mathematics of what Operation Downfall would require, and he was watching another option take shape. On August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay dropped a single bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb was called Little Boy. It was a uranium fission device, a weapon unlike anything that had ever existed in the history of warfare. It exploded with a force equivalent to 15,000 tons of conventional explosive. The fireball reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. Within seconds, the center of Hiroshima was vaporized. Within a mile of the detonation point, almost every structure was destroyed and almost every person was dead or dying. By the end of 1945, the bomb would kill between 70,000 and 140,000 people. 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb, a plutonium device called Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki. It killed between 40,000 and 80,000 people. These numbers are staggering. They are almost beyond comprehension. And they were the numbers that, finally, cracked something inside the Japanese imperial government that years of conventional bombing, years of naval blockade, years of grinding island-by-island defeat had failed to crack. Emperor Hirohito made a decision: he would surrender. This was not a simple thing. The Japanese military establishment, the men who had built their entire lives and identities around the Bushido Code, around the absolute impossibility of submission, around the divine mission of the emperor himself, did not accept the decision without a fight. There was an attempted coup the night before Hirohito's recorded speech was to be broadcast to the Japanese people. Officers stormed the imperial palace trying to find and destroy the recording. They failed by the narrowest of margins. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice for the first time in their lives. In formal, almost incomprehensible court language, Hirohito announced that Japan had decided to end the war. He did not use the word surrender. He spoke of bearing the unbearable, enduring the unendurable, but the meaning was clear. In military units across Asia, Japanese officers wept. Some shot themselves, some went through with suicide rituals that had been prepared in advance. Others simply stood and stared at the ground, unable to process what they had heard. And now the question became not whether Japan had surrendered, but how the surrender would be formalized. And this was where Douglas MacArthur's role became pivotal, because it was MacArthur who had been designated by President Truman to oversee the surrender ceremony. MacArthur, who would stand as the supreme commander for the Allied powers and accept on behalf of all the Allied nations Japan's unconditional capitulation. MacArthur understood with the instinct of a man who had spent his entire life thinking about symbols and ceremony and the weight of history, that this moment had to be done exactly right, not just for the practical purposes of ending the war, but for something larger, something that would determine whether the peace that followed would hold. Japan's military culture ran on ritual. It ran on hierarchy and face and the public performance of honor. If MacArthur got this wrong, if he allowed it to descend into a humiliation so complete that it became a wound rather than a conclusion, he risked creating exactly the kind of myth that had poisoned Germany after the First World War: the stab in the back myth, the undefeated in the field myth. The story that a proud people told themselves to avoid accepting that they had truly, completely, irreversibly lost. But if he was too lenient, if the ceremony conveyed any ambiguity about who had won and who had lost, he risked something equally dangerous. He risked the Japanese military establishment convincing itself and convincing the Japanese people that they had negotiated a kind of draw. That they could rebuild their military culture around the emperor and the Bushido Code and try again in a generation. MacArthur had to thread an almost impossibly narrow needle, and he knew it. The preparations for the ceremony were meticulous. The USS Missouri had been chosen partly for practical reasons, its size and the symbolic appropriateness of a battleship, but also because Missouri was the home state of President Harry Truman. MacArthur, who had a complicated and sometimes openly antagonistic relationship with the American political establishment, understood the value of gestures toward the commander-in-chief. The Missouri had been positioned in Tokyo Bay deliberately. This was not a ceremony taking place on neutral ground or in some conference room in a liberated city. This was taking place in Japanese home waters within sight of the Japanese coast, with a fleet of Allied warships surrounding it in every direction. Every visual detail communicated the same message: this is over, you are defeated, and we are here in your own bay to make that permanent. The table that would hold the surrender documents was set up on the veranda deck overlooking the starboard side of the ship. MacArthur's staff had located an old table, a simple mess table, and covered it with a green felt cloth that had been used in Reims, Germany, when Germany had surrendered just a few months earlier. Some accounts dispute the details of the table's provenance, but the intent was clear regardless. This was a table with history, a table that had already witnessed the ending of one totalitarian empire and was now about to witness the ending of another. Behind the table, arranged with the precision of a theatrical set, were the flags of the Allied nations: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. Hundreds of Allied officers, sailors, and correspondents crowded every available inch of deck space, balancing on turrets and hanging from railings to get a view. Newsreel cameras were positioned. Photographers jostled for position. The world was watching, or would be, as soon as the footage reached every corner of the earth. MacArthur had given precise instructions about how the ceremony would proceed. He had given precise instructions about his own demeanor and appearance. He would wear his familiar khaki uniform, no tie, no medals beyond his rank insignia, and his gold-braided cap. He had worn decorations and medals throughout the war, but on this day he chose plainness. The plainness was itself a kind of statement. He did not need to embellish himself. The moment embellished him. The Japanese delegation arrived by destroyer, transferred to the Missouri by launch. There were 11 of them. They were led by Mamoru Shigemitsu, the foreign minister of Japan, who would sign on behalf of the Japanese government. He had been Japan's ambassador to Great Britain before the war. A sophisticated diplomat who had lost a leg to a Korean assassin's bomb in 1932 and who now walked on a wooden prosthetic, making the gangway of the Missouri an agony of slow, painful ascension that every watching eye on that deck could see. Behind Shigemitsu came General Yoshijiro Umezu, the army chief of staff, who had been one of the most powerful advocates for continued resistance until the emperor's personal intervention had ended the debate. Umezu had not wanted to come. He had said as much. He had considered suicide rather than face this moment. His staff had talked him out of it, persuading him that his presence was a military duty, that Japan needed its army chief to be seen formally accepting the emperor's decision. But the contempt and fury and shame on Umezu's face as he stood on that deck were visible to every person present. The Japanese delegation descended from the gangway onto the deck and walked across to the table. They arranged themselves in a line, stiff and still, their faces blank with the practiced blankness of men who have decided to show nothing because anything they showed would be too much. And here is where the watching Allied officers noticed something. The Japanese delegation did not bow. Japanese culture, bowing is not merely a gesture of politeness. It is the fundamental physical language of hierarchy and acknowledgement. You bow to your superiors. You bow to acknowledge respect, authority, occasion. The depth and duration of the bow communicates the magnitude of what is being acknowledged. To bow deeply, profoundly, as the situation on that deck demanded, would have been to express in the most ancient and unambiguous terms of Japanese culture exactly what this moment meant: defeat. Submission, the end. The Japanese officers stood ramrod straight. Their faces were stone. Their eyes looked forward or slightly downward, but not in the humble cast of a bow. In the rigid, clenched immobility of men refusing in the last available arena to perform what was being asked of them. It was a defiance stripped of everything except the gesture itself. They had no army anymore, or what remained of it was standing down across Asia and the Pacific at that very moment. They had no navy, their air force was grounded, their cities had been burned and blasted, their emperor had spoken, everything was over. But they would not bow their heads. The watching Allied officers exchanged glances. This small, silent refusal sent a ripple through the assembled crowd on that deck, not a gasp, not an outburst, something quieter and more dangerous, an understanding that something had just happened that required a response. What would MacArthur do? Douglas MacArthur stepped forward to the microphone. He was 65 years old. He had been fighting this war in one form or another since before most of the men on that deck had been born. He had fled the Philippines in a PT boat with the sound of Japanese guns in his ears. He had watched his men die on beaches and in jungles across a quarter of the Pacific Ocean. He had planned the battles and signed the orders and read the casualty reports that turned human beings into numbers, and then turned those numbers back into human beings when the reports arrived from the hospitals. He looked at the Japanese delegation standing before him. And then Douglas MacArthur did something that, in retrospect, revealed the extraordinary calculation at the center of everything he was. He did not react to the lack of bowing, not directly, not with visible anger, not with any gesture of displeasure that could be seen or measured. He did not demand a bow. He did not call the delegation out for their defiance. He did not do what every instinct of a man of his temperament and history might have demanded, which was to make the Japanese officers feel the full humiliation of what they were refusing to perform. Instead, he began to speak. His voice, when he addressed the assembled crowd and the cameras and the listening world, was measured and deliberate and exactly as loud as it needed to be. He spoke slowly, giving each word its full weight, understanding that these words were going to be quoted and printed and broadcast and remembered. "We are gathered here," he said, "representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies have been determined on the battlefields of the world and hence are not for our discussion or debate. Nor is it for us here to meet, representing as we do a majority of the people of the earth, in a spirit of distrust, malice, or hatred. But rather it is for us, both victors and vanquished, to rise to that higher dignity which alone benefits the sacred purposes we are about to serve, committing all our people unreservedly to faithful compliance with the undertaking they are here formally to assume." He paused. "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice." The words fell across the deck like something solid. Allied officers who had come expecting to feel triumph, pure and uncomplicated, found themselves hearing something more complicated and more lasting. MacArthur was not gloating. He was not celebrating. He was not doing what victorious generals had done for all of recorded history, parading the conquered enemy in front of a jeering crowd, demanding obeisance, extracting the maximum possible theater from the vanquished. He was doing something else entirely. He was making it clear with every word he chose and every word he deliberately did not choose that this ceremony was not about revenge. It was about settlement, permanent, irreversible, dignified settlement. And in choosing that tone, in refusing to acknowledge the silent defiance of the Japanese officers who would not bow, MacArthur was executing a strategy that went far beyond the ceremony itself. He was thinking, as he had been thinking for months, about what came after the ceremony, about the occupation, about the reconstruction, about the transformation of Japan from an imperial militarist power into a functioning democracy that could become a stable and peaceful part of the post-war world. MacArthur understood something about the Japanese military mind that many of his contemporaries did not fully appreciate. If he had forced the Japanese officers to bow, if he had demanded it, if he had made it a spectacle of submission, he would have turned them into martyrs in their own culture's story. Japan's warrior tradition did not look kindly on those who submitted, but it had enormous reverence for those who endured humiliation with dignity. By demanding nothing, by proceeding with his ceremony as if the question of bowing had never arisen, MacArthur was denying the Japanese officers the narrative they perhaps wanted. The narrative of resistance, even here, even at the end. He was also, and this is the crucial point, demonstrating an absolute command of the situation that needed no theatrical enforcement. He was the supreme commander. He had no need to demand that anyone bow to him. His authority over every person on that deck was total and undisputed. The Japanese officers' refusal to bow did not diminish that authority by a single fraction. And MacArthur's decision not to make an issue of it was itself the most powerful possible statement of that authority. A man who is truly in command does not need to demand respect, he emanates it. Mamoru Shigemitsu approached the table on his prosthetic leg, his painful and slow progress watched in complete silence. He picked up the pen and signed the surrendered documents on behalf of the Japanese government. General Umezu followed, his face an almost perfect mask of controlled emotion, and signed on behalf of the Imperial Japanese General Headquarters. Then came the Allied signatories. General MacArthur signed first on behalf of all the Allied powers using not one pen but 5. He had brought multiple pens deliberately, intending to give them as mementos to people who mattered to him and to the war's history. One pen went to General Jonathan Wainwright, who had remained behind on Corregidor when MacArthur was evacuated in 1942, who had surrendered Bataan and Corregidor to the Japanese, who had spent 3 years in Japanese prisoner of war camps enduring conditions of deliberate brutality, and who now stood on that deck alive and gaunt and present for the closing of the chapter that had nearly killed him. MacArthur looked at Wainwright as he handed him one of the pens. There was something in that exchange that went beyond ceremony and words. Wainwright's sunken face, the bones showing through skin thinned by years of starvation rations, was a living record of what Japanese captivity had meant for the men who had been left behind. MacArthur, carrying that guilt, or something that functioned like guilt regardless of how he might have rationalized it, understood the gravity of that handoff. Another pen went to General Arthur Percival, the British commander who had surrendered Singapore to the Japanese in February 1942. The fall of Singapore being one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history, Percival himself a prisoner of war for 3.5 years. Like Wainwright, Percival was skeletal, aged beyond his years, visibly marked by what Japanese captivity had done to him. These men, these survivors, were MacArthur's answer to the Japanese officers who had declined to bow their heads. He needed no ceremony of submission from the Japanese delegation. He had brought his own symbols of what Japanese power had cost the world, and they were standing 10 feet away. Other Allied commanders signed in turn: Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz for the United States, General HSU Yongchang for the Republic of China, Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser for the United Kingdom, Lieutenant General Kuzma Derivienko for the Soviet Union, General Sir Thomas Blamey for Australia, Colonel Lawrence Moore Cosgrave for Canada, General Philippe Leclerc de Hautecloque for France, Lieutenant Admiral Conrad Helfrich for the Netherlands, Air Vice Marshal Leonard Issett for New Zealand. Each signature was a nail in the coffin of the old order in Asia and the Pacific. Each signature represented nations that had poured blood and treasure into a war that had begun, depending on how you counted, either in September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland, or in July 1937 with Japan's invasion of China, or even in September 1931 with Japan's seizure of Manchuria. A war that had consumed somewhere between 70 and 85 million human lives before this morning, before this deck, before these pens moving across these papers. When the last signature was complete, MacArthur stepped back to the microphone. "Let us pray," he said, "that peace now be restored to the world and that God will preserve it always." And then, with the same precision and completeness with which he had opened the ceremony, he closed it. "These proceedings are closed." But the story does not end with the ceremony. The story of what MacArthur did when the Japanese officers refused to bow continued far beyond that September morning. Because what MacArthur did next, in the days and weeks and months that followed, was in many ways even more remarkable than his composure on the deck of the Missouri. On August the 30th, 2 days before the surrender ceremony, MacArthur had landed at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. He had stepped off the Bataan, his personal transport aircraft, in front of cameras and watching Japanese officials, and he had done it without a visible security escort, without armored vehicles, without the kind of military phalanx that any reasonable assessment of the risk would have demanded. There were an estimated 3 million Japanese troops still under arms in the home islands. There were tens of thousands of kamikaze pilots whose planes were fueled and ready. There were fanatical military officers who had made no secret of their belief that the emperor's surrender announcement was illegitimate and that the war should and would continue. MacArthur's aides in the American military establishment had begged him not to land at Atsugi without a massive armed escort. MacArthur had refused to consider it. He had understood with absolute clarity that how he arrived in Japan mattered as much as anything he would do after he arrived. If he came in surrounded by tanks and guns and soldiers with rifles at the ready, he would be communicating fear. He would be communicating uncertainty. He would be suggesting that he was not entirely sure the war was over. By walking off that aircraft casually, by lighting his corncob pipe and looking around at the Japanese crowds watching from a distance with the relaxed confidence of a man arriving at a place where he has always intended to be, MacArthur was communicating something entirely different. The war is over. I know it is over. I have always known it would end this way. And now we are going to do what needs to be done next. One American officer watching the landing later wrote that it was the single bravest thing he had ever seen, and he had seen a great deal. The occupation of Japan that followed was one of the most extraordinary exercises of personal power in the 20th century. MacArthur was given authority over Japan so sweeping that he effectively became what he himself called the blue-eyed shogun. He had more real power over more people than any American had ever possessed in history. He used that power with a clarity of purpose and an understanding of Japanese culture that surprised many of the people who had expected him to govern as a conqueror. His first and most fundamental decision was about the emperor. There had been considerable debate in Washington about what to do with Hirohito. The Soviet Union had wanted him tried as a war criminal. Many in the United States, including members of the Senate and large sections of the American public who had read the accounts of Bataan and the other Japanese atrocities, wanted him executed or at minimum imprisoned. The argument for treating Hirohito as a war criminal was not without merit. He had been emperor throughout Japan's expansion in Asia. He had received briefings on military operations. The extent to which he had been a passive figurehead or an active participant in Japanese war planning remained genuinely uncertain, and to some extent remains uncertain today. MacArthur's view was unambiguous: putting Hirohito on trial would be catastrophic. The Japanese people's relationship with their emperor was not merely political loyalty, it was spiritual devotion. To put the emperor in the dock would be to put Japan's entire identity and national soul in the dock alongside him. It would create a wound so deep and so permanent that it could not heal within a generation, perhaps within several generations. It would make occupation and reconstruction nearly impossible, requiring not tens of thousands of American troops but hundreds of thousands, perhaps for decades. More practically, MacArthur needed Hirohito alive and functioning, because Hirohito's decision to surrender and his continued public acceptance of defeat was the most powerful possible signal to the millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians who might otherwise have continued fighting. The emperor had spoken. The war was over. This was not a political decision or a military calculation. It was divine instruction. MacArthur met with Hirohito privately at the American embassy in Tokyo on September the 27th, less than a month after the surrender ceremony. The emperor arrived in formal morning coat and striped trousers. MacArthur met him in his customary khaki uniform without a tie. The symbolism was not accidental, but what MacArthur said about the meeting afterward was more remarkable than the visual contrast. He said that Hirohito had arrived prepared to take personal responsibility for everything that Japan had done in the war, that the emperor had offered himself as a war criminal if that was what was required. MacArthur's account of this has been disputed by Japanese historians and by evidence from other sources about what was actually said in that meeting. The truth is almost certainly more complicated than either party's version. But what MacArthur took from the meeting, and what he communicated to Washington, was that Hirohito's cooperation was genuine and essential, and that treating him as a war criminal would be a strategic catastrophe. Washington, after considerable internal debate, accepted MacArthur's judgment. Hirohito was retained as a constitutional monarch. He was not charged with war crimes, He would remain Emperor of Japan until his death in 1989. The occupation MacArthur administered transformed Japan with a speed and completeness that astonished the world. He abolished the Japanese military. He dissolved the ultranationalist organizations. He freed political prisoners, including communists and socialists who had been imprisoned during the war years. He broke up the zaibatsu, the great industrial and financial conglomerates that had been the economic engine of Japanese militarism. He introduced land reform, redistributing agricultural land from landlords to farmers and dismantling one of the most ancient sources of social inequality and rural poverty in Japanese society. He extended full civil rights to women, including the right to vote, which Japanese women had never had before. He gave the trade unions the right to organize. He reformed the education system, removing the militarist and nationalist ideology that had been embedded in Japanese schoolbooks and replacing it with a curriculum built around democratic values. And he oversaw the writing of a new Japanese constitution, a document that was in many respects drafted by MacArthur's own staff in the space of about a week in early 1946, working against a deadline that MacArthur himself had set. The new constitution contained Article 9, which formally renounced war as an instrument of national policy and prohibited Japan from maintaining war potential. It was one of the most extraordinary constitutional provisions in the history of democratic governance, a nation writing into its own fundamental law a permanent prohibition on the kind of military aggression that had brought it to the deck of the Missouri. Whether Article 9 was wise or naive, whether it reflected a genuine transformation of Japanese national values, or was simply an imposed constraint that would be quietly eroded over time, whether it has served the cause of peace or merely displaced the responsibility for defending Japan onto the United States, these are questions that political scientists and historians debate to this day. What is not in question is that the Japan that emerged from MacArthur's occupation was fundamentally different from the Japan that had sent its officers to stand stone-faced on the deck of the Missouri. It was democratic, pacifist in its formal constitution, economically dynamic, and within a generation one of the most prosperous nations on Earth. The Japanese economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s, the transformation of a bombed-out nation into a global industrial powerhouse, grew directly from the foundations MacArthur's occupation had laid. But what of the men who had stood on that deck and refused to bow their heads? What happened to the Japanese officers who had made that last silent act of defiance as their empire formally ceased to exist? General Yashijiro Umezu, the army chief of staff who had been so vehement in his opposition to surrender and so visibly controlled in his rage on the Missouri's deck, was indicted as a war criminal and tried before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. He was convicted in 1948 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1949 of cancer. He converted to Christianity shortly before his death, a fact that Japanese nationalists of later generations found either moving or incomprehensible depending on their point of view. Mamoru Shigemitsu, the foreign minister who had signed first and whose laborious progress on his prosthetic leg across the deck had been one of the most striking visual images of the ceremony, was also tried before the Tokyo Tribunal. He was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He was released in 1950 and returned to Japanese politics, eventually serving again as foreign minister in the 1950s. He died in 1950.